Osipovichi Railway Junction, Belarus. July 30th, 1943. The marshalling yards are busy with the kind of traffic that sustains an army. Fuel trains moving east toward the front, ammunition trains queued for departure, and somewhere in the yard, flat cars carrying a consignment of Tiger tanks on their way to reinforce positions being hammered by Soviet pressure. After Kursk, a railway worker named Fyodor Kitlovich moves through the yard as he has moved through it many times before. He's not a soldier. He carries no weapon visible to any guard watching him. In his pocket is a small metal object, not much larger than his finger, and a block of explosive that he has concealed where no routine inspection would find it. He attaches the device to the undercarriage of a fuel train, sets the mechanism, and walks away. Hours later, the fire that starts in the fuel cars spreads through the junction and catches everything around it. 2 ammunition trains, the fuel train and the flat cars carrying the Tigers. The Osipovichi diversion, as it became known, was described by multiple historical sources as the largest single partisan sabotage action of the entire Second World War, accomplished not by a commando raid, not by air attack, not by a frontal assault, but by one man with a small device that looked, in the words of the era, like nothing more threatening than a writing implement. What Kitlovich used that day was a variation of the chemical time delay fuse, a device that would be activated, placed, and left to work entirely on its own, firing at a predetermined time with no further human involvement, no observer, no detonator button, no soldier standing near enough to be caught. The weapon was the delay itself. Understanding how that weapon came to exist, how the Soviet Union arrived at the doctrine and technology of remote destruction without presence, requires starting with a man born in the village of Voinovo in the Oriol region in 1900, whose father was a railway worker and who as a small child watched his father light flares to warn a train driver about a broken rail. That image, Ilya Starinov later said, never left him. Ilya Grigorievich Starinov would eventually be called the grandfather of Soviet Spetsnaz, the god of sabotage, the genius of mine warfare. German intelligence eventually placed a bounty of 200,000 Reichsmarks on his head. Hitler, on being told that Soviet forces had used radio-controlled mines to destroy the headquarters of the 68th Infantry Division in Kharkov, killing Lieutenant General Georg von Braun, brother of the rocket designer Werner von Braun, at a distance of nearly 300 kilometers, reportedly demanded of Field Marshal Keitel, "Nonsense. We have no radio mines." Do they really have them? Keitel confirmed they did. Starinov had placed them. He was born to railways and explosives simultaneously and spent his entire working life developing the intersection of the two. After the Russian Civil War, he graduated with honors from the Voronezh School of Military Railway Technicians, then served in the Soviet railway troops through the 1920s. By his late 20s, he was already working on what would become his signature idea, a compact mine specifically designed to destroy railway trains, in contrast to the enormous, unwieldy explosive devices available at the time. The Pravda Tribute, published after his death in 2000, he reached the age of 100, described how, at 27, Starinov designed the PMS, the Starinov train mine, which the article called a formidable weapon in the hands of the partisans during the war years. The infernal machines of that time were very heavy and bulky. Starinov changed that. He then did something that no training manual suggested. He went to Spain. In 1936, under the pseudonym Rodolfo, Starinov was sent to work with Republican forces during the Spanish Civil War. He trained partisan groups in mine and demolitions technique, and he conducted independent operations himself. His most celebrated Spanish operation involved laying explosives beneath a railway track in advance of a train carrying Italian pilots sent by Mussolini to reinforce Franco's air force. The train never reached its destination. During his work in Spain, Starinov conducted and oversaw more than 200 sabotage operations by various accounts, and what he brought back to the Soviet Union when he returned was something that no classroom exercise could have provided: a granular, failure-tested understanding of exactly how the gap between planting a device and detonating it could be made operationally decisive. The specific problem he had identified was the problem of the fuse. A demolition charge placed under a railway track required a fuse to detonate it. A burning safety fuse offered delays measured in minutes, enough time for a soldier to retreat a safe distance, but not enough time to establish an alibi or avoid the vicinity entirely if guards arrived quickly. A mechanical clockwork timer was reliable but bulky, difficult to conceal, and produced the audible ticking that anyone who has seen even a bad spy film has been led to associate with hidden bombs. What Starinov wanted, what the entire logic of undetected long-range sabotage required, was a device that could be placed, activated, and left to function entirely silently over a period of hours, giving the operative time not just to leave but to be somewhere verifiable, somewhere that no reasonable German officer would connect to whatever catastrophe was about to happen to a train. The solution existed in chemistry. The British Special Operations Executive developed the most widely documented version of this approach independently during the same period, creating what their supply catalogues called the Switch Number 10 delay, universally known to the agents who used it as the time pencil. The British device was a brass or aluminium tube, approximately the size and shape of a writing pencil, with a copper section at one end containing a glass vial of cupric chloride. Beneath the vial, held under tension, was a spring-loaded striker. The timer was started by crushing the copper end of the tube, breaking the vial and releasing the liquid onto a thin metal wire. The acid, more precisely, a corrosive copper salt solution, though the term acid was widely used by both the agents and their trainers, ate through the wire at a predictable rate determined by the wire's gauge and the temperature. When the wire failed, the striker flew forward and hit a percussion cap, firing the detonator. Delays could range from 10 minutes to 24 hours, depending on the wire thickness, and the pencils were color-coded, yellow for a 6.5-hour delay, red for shorter periods, and so on across the spectrum. After activation, the device was completely silent. No ticking, no fizzing, no mechanical movement visible or audible. A device placed in a dark corner of a locomotive shed or attached to a fuel line beneath a tank car was, from the moment of activation, indistinguishable from any other piece of metal in the vicinity. The operative was already gone. The mechanism worked, or it did not work. If it worked, the charge detonated hours later, at whatever time the wire gave way. If it did not work, if the liquid had been diluted by water, infiltrating a defective seal, or if the temperature had dropped far enough to slow the corrosion to a crawl, then nothing happened at all, which was itself an acceptable outcome. No body, no arrest, no trail. The Soviet approach drew on the same chemical principles and developed parallel systems, with Starinov's influence visible in the adaptation of these devices for the specific requirements of railway sabotage at scale. The standingwellback.com analysis of Soviet IED development in this period, drawing on declassified U.S. military exploitation of captured German EOD reports, makes clear that Soviet demolition technology in this category was more extensive and sophisticated than Western military histories typically acknowledge. German EOD engineers encountered Soviet time delay devices throughout the Eastern Front campaign and documented them in technical reports that American analysts later studied carefully during the early Cold War period. The German engineers noted, in the words quoted by that analysis, that the Russian soldier is particularly ingenious in installing improvised mines and booby traps. This was not amateur improvisation, it was doctrine, and Starinov was its architect. Now, before we get into the 3-year campaign that these devices helped prosecute and the numbers that resulted, if this level of research is why you came, subscribe. It takes a moment, costs nothing, and means the channel can keep making content like this. Let's talk about what the Soviet railway sabotage campaign actually looked like in practice. The problem Germany faced on the Eastern Front was a logistics problem of a scale that no military in history had previously attempted to solve. From the Baltic coast to the Black Sea, the Wehrmacht needed to move ammunition, fuel, food, replacement equipment, reinforcements, and medical supplies along a front that stretched more than 2,400 kilometers. The Soviet road network was primitive by Western European standards. Horse-drawn transport, while massive in scale, was far too slow and far too limited in capacity for the volumes required. The German army's dependence on the railway network was not a preference, it was a structural necessity. By close to 100% estimates suggest, German supplies to the Eastern Front lines passed through the rail network, largely through the former Polish and Soviet territories that their armies had already overrun. Every train that did not reach its destination was a gap in the supply chain that something else had to fill, and on the Eastern Front that something else usually did not exist. The Soviet Union recognized this dependency from the beginning of the war, and the partisan network that Moscow began organizing in the forests of Belarusia, Ukraine, and occupied Russia was tasked explicitly with attacking it. The early partisan movement was disorganized and under-equipped. The chaotic nature of the German invasion had cut off many potential leaders, and supply by air was sporadic at best. But as the war stabilized and the partisan network grew, two things changed. The quality of training improved through Starinov's influence, and the supply of appropriate equipment, including chemical time delay fuses, improved through air resupply and parachute drops. The numbers that resulted are documented in German military records and cross-referenced in Soviet accounts with enough consistency to be reliable in their broad outlines. Between June and November 1942, more than 300 trains were derailed in the occupied territories, with the Warfare History Network's account of Soviet partisan operations citing this figure from German records. In Belarusia alone during the same period, more than 800 trains were derailed. Hundreds of railway bridges were destroyed. By the end of 1942, 10% of the German field divisions on the Eastern Front had been switched from combat to anti-partisan duties, pulled from the line not because they had been defeated in battle, but because the railway network that supplied the line required a security garrison that the existing rear area forces could no longer provide. An Army Group Center report from December 1942, quoted in the Warfare History Network's account, captures the operational reality with unusual bluntness. The commandant of an army rear area wrote, "The troops left to this command are just sufficient to protect the most important installations and, to a certain extent, the railroads and highways. For anti-partisan operations, there are no longer any troops on hand." The implication was precise. Germany was already losing the security battle over its own supply lines, and it had not yet encountered the coordinated operations that 1943 would bring. Then came Operation Rail War. In June 1943, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Belarusia passed a resolution formalizing what had previously been improvised, a systematic, coordinated campaign to destroy German rail lines at scale, combined with a general strike of railway workers designed to prevent reconstruction. The timing was deliberate. Soviet planners were preparing the counteroffensive that would follow Kursk, and they understood that disrupting German resupply during the battle's critical phase could be as valuable as any tank action at the front. Ilya Starinov was one of the primary organizers, working through the partisan movement staff that had been established in 1942 to bring coherence to what had previously been a dispersed collection of independent units. The July 22, 1943 operation gave an indication of what was coming. On a single day, 220 demolitions were recorded on the railway running north-south behind the German front. On the same day, Fyodor Kitlevich attached his device to the fuel train at Osipovichi. The fire spread. 2 ammunition trains, the fuel train itself, and the consignment of Tiger tanks were consumed. The BelarusGuide.com account of partisan resistance in Belarus, drawing on Belarusian historical sources, describes the Osipovichi diversion as the greatest partisan sabotage action of the entire Second World War. It was carried out by one man with a small device activated by chemistry and timed by the slow dissolution of a metal wire in a corrosive solution. There was no assault team, no firefight, no soldier within range of the explosion when it came. Then came August 2nd. The LeftHorizons.com account of the Soviet partisan campaign, drawing on the research of Andy Ford, documents what happened across the occupied territory on a single night. 10,000 charges were laid on rail lines, of which 8,000 detonated. The standing Wellback analysis of this operation, citing German Army Group reports, states that the Germans themselves recorded 10,900 demolition charges laid on the night of August 2nd to 3rd alone, with over 8,000 functioning as intended. The result: 266 locomotives were damaged or destroyed, and 500,000 feet of replacement rail stock, enough to repair enormous lengths of damaged track, was made unusable. In September 1943, more than 100 evacuation trains were stranded in the marshalling yards at Gomel for 3 days because the approaches were blocked by partisan sabotage. German documents examined after the war revealed that Soviet forces destroyed 20,505 rails in Belarus alone between August and November 1943. Operation Concert, the follow-up campaign launched in September 1943 under the coordination of the partisan movement staff, involved 193 partisan detachments and groups, totaling more than 210,000 men, women, and children. It destroyed 150,000 rails across the occupied territories and disrupted German transportation so severely that, according to the Russia Beyond account drawing on Soviet operational records, German traffic on the Eastern Front fell by approximately 40% during the critical period of the Soviet Autumn Offensive. The D-Day Center's analysis of World War II's impact on European rail networks, drawing on the research of historian Richard J. Crampton, offers perhaps the most sobering summary of what this meant at the strategic level. Resistance operations destroyed or delayed 1/8 of all German transports to the Eastern Front. In some regions, German forces ended up assigning at least half their armed forces to railroad security, cutting forests for hundreds of meters along tracks to eliminate partisan hiding places, deploying armored trains, installing guard posts at every bridge, every culvert, every elevation change that offered an attacker a position of advantage. Despite all of this, the attacks kept coming. The economics of this contest were brutally one-sided. A German locomotive by 1943 represented months of industrial production and dozens of skilled workers. A derailed train loaded with ammunition or fuel represented losses that could not be rapidly replaced in an economy already stretched to its limits. A time delay fuse cost almost nothing to manufacture, required minutes to place, and needed no soldier anywhere near the target at the moment of detonation. The ratio of cost imposed to cost incurred favored the partisans at every level: material, human, logistical, and psychological. The psychological dimension is harder to measure than the locomotives, but not harder to observe. The Warfare History Network account of Soviet partisan operations documents a German garrison report from late 1942 describing how the news of Stalingrad's approaching catastrophe, spreading through the occupied rear areas, combined with increased partisan activity along supply routes to produce a depressing psychological effect on troops in town and village garrisons tasked with guarding bridges and rail junctions. German soldiers assigned to railway security duty were not on the Eastern Front by choice. They were there because the alternative, leaving the railway unguarded, had already proven catastrophic. They were there knowing that the partisans they were supposed to stop might have placed a device days ago on a track they had walked that morning and would walk again tomorrow. The uncertainty of the delay fuse, its complete silence, its complete invisibility between activation and detonation, was itself a feature, not a limitation. The comparative context matters. Britain's Special Operations Executive had developed sophisticated sabotage doctrine and the time pencil independently, airdropping both agents and equipment into occupied France, Norway, and elsewhere. Their operations against European railways produced real results, particularly in the lead-up to D-Day when French resistance attacks severed critical rail routes to Normandy. But the scale of the Soviet partisan campaign dwarfs anything the SOE attempted. The StandingWellBack.com analysis puts it directly. Soviet sabotage operations frankly make the efforts of the British SOE or American OSS look very paltry in comparison. The difference was not capability. The British number 10 delay switch and its Soviet equivalents operated on identical principles. The difference was the breadth of the network, the hundreds of thousands of people who by 1943 were operating as partisans behind German lines, many of whom had been trained by Starinov's network of demolition schools, many of whom had been supplied by air with the devices and explosives they needed, and all of whom were embedded in a landscape that the German army could patrol but could never fully control. The title of this episode names 500 trains. That number is documentably conservative. Operation Koval Uzul, a single coordinated partisan operation against the Kovel railway junction in Ukraine from July 1943 to March 1944, under the command of partisan leader Alexei Fedorov, destroyed 549 enemy echelons, trains carrying ammunition, fuel, military equipment, and troops on the lines of the Kovel junction alone. That is one junction, 9 months, one commander. The Belarus statistics for the broader rail war period record 800 derailments in Belarusia between June and November 1942 alone, before the coordinated operations of 1943 even began. The aggregate across the full campaign, across all occupied territories, across 1942, 1943, and into the preparations for Operation Bagration in 1944, runs well into the thousands. The Bagration preparation in June 1944 produced what the StandingWellBack.com analysis describes as one of the most intense explosive sabotage campaigns in military history. On the night of June 19, 1944, more than 9,500 explosive attacks were conducted in a single night across the rail network behind German lines. Over 5 nights from June 19th, 40,000 demolitions were laid across the occupied territories, disabling mile upon mile of track and destroying rolling stock. The Soviet conventional offensive that followed advanced nearly 600 kilometers in 2.5 months, one of the most successful offensive operations of the entire war, in part because the German army behind the front line was already paralyzed before the first Soviet tank crossed the line of departure. None of this began with a general's order or a tank regiment's assault. It began with a concept that the most valuable target in a modern industrial war was the supply line connecting a fighting army to the factories that kept it alive, and that the supply line could be attacked by a small number of people with small devices and a great deal of patience. Ilya Starinov had understood this before the war began. He spent the 1920s developing compact train mines when everyone else was using bulky artillery shells packed with explosive. He spent the 1930s teaching improvised demolition technique when the NKVD prevented him from teaching the manufactured devices he would have preferred to use. He spent the Spanish Civil War testing his concepts against a real enemy and refining them. And when Germany invaded in 1941, he was ready with doctrine, technology, and a training network that could transmit both across hundreds of kilometers of forest and swamp to the men and women who would carry the small metal tubes and the blocks of explosive that turned Fyodor Kitlovich from a railway worker into the man who started the largest single sabotage fire of the war. Return to Osipovichi, July 30th, 1943. The marshalling yards burning, the Tiger tanks on their flat cars consumed before they fired a single round. 2 ammunition trains destroyed, their contents contributing to the fire rather than to any German gun. Fyodor Kitlovich is not there. He has been somewhere else for hours. The device he placed has already done everything it was ever asked to do, and it has done it in complete silence from the moment he walked away until the moment the fire began. That is what the chemical time delay fuse actually was. Not a pencil, not a toy, a weapon of patience, the most powerful weapon available to a force that could not fight in the open, deployed by people who understood something that the German army, for all its artillery and armor and aerial superiority, could not easily counter. That a man who is not there when the explosion happens is very difficult to catch.